June 6, 1944. At 5 a.m., at Crisbecq Battery on the Normandy coast, Lieutenant Walter Ohmsen watched an image that would haunt him for life. Through the pre-dawn gloom, the English Channel had become a steel highway. An endless armada of 6,939 vessels, including 1,213 warships and 4,126 landing craft, was stretching from horizon to horizon. This was an image that directly contradicted every assurance from the German High Command. Ohmsen's battery received the order to open fire at 5:52 a.m. 3 minutes later, the first shells from his 210mm Skoda cannons arced toward the fleet. It was, as the text describes, merely drops of water against an approaching tsunami. Ohmsen, a 32-year-old naval officer, became the first German defender to sight and engage the Allied invasion. What he saw was the mathematics of defeat sailing toward him at 8 knots. Just hours later, German officers across Normandy would witness a demonstration of Allied industrial might that would shatter every assumption about their enemy's capabilities and mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's thousand-year Reich. While Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was absent, convinced the weather was too poor for an invasion, German staff monitored increasingly disturbing reports. Massive parachute drops across Normandy from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, totaling over 13,000 men, signaled the start. General Erich Marx, a veteran of the Eastern Front, possessed sharp tactical instinct. Yet even this experienced commander could not imagine the sheer scale of the approaching force. The German defenders had prepared to fight the last war. The Allies were bringing the next one. The German High Command had convinced itself that the Allies could mount an invasion with perhaps 20 divisions and 3,000 vessels, basing these limits on their own industrial exhaustion. Instead, observers reported thousands of ships, not a raid, but the largest amphibious invasion in human history. At strongpoint WN-62, overlooking Omaha Beach, 20-year-old Gerhard Heinrich Seo peered through his machine gun's embrasure. He saw no ocean at all, only steel. Ships were everywhere. Big ships, small ships, flat-bottomed ships, and destroyers racing back and forth. He tried to count, but gave up at 100. Across the 50-mile invasion front, German soldiers realized they were facing an entirely different order of magnitude. The naval bombardment commenced at 5:30 a.m., involving 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, and 65 destroyers. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from its 14-inch guns in the first hour. Each 1,400-pound shell meant one ship delivered 178 tons of high explosives in 60 minutes, more than many German artillery regiments possessed in total ammunition reserves. Before the first soldier set foot on the beaches, Allied naval forces had fired approximately 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance. General Gunther Blumentritt later testified, "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories." At 6 a.m., the second demonstration of Allied superiority began as the sky filled with thousands of aircraft. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties to support the landings, having already secured air supremacy. The Luftwaffe had approximately 300 operational aircraft in all of France. They managed only 319 sorties on D-Day, compared to the Allies' 14,674. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied aircraft. The mathematics were absurd. Major Josef Priller made the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches that morning, strafing Stord Beach once with just his wingmen before fleeing. This incident demonstrated the complete impotence of German air power. Despite this overwhelming firepower, the German defenders at certain positions initially believed they might hold. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division occupied excellent defensive positions. The first waves of American infantry walked into a slaughter. From his bunker, Heinrich Scheel fired over 12,000 rounds from his MG-42 machine gun that morning, watching American soldiers fall by the dozens and hundreds. For a brief moment, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might hold. Then, the destroyers came. At approximately 8 a.m., with the situation on Omaha Beach critical, American destroyers, ignoring the risk of mines or grounding, closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach. Ships like the USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt turned their 5-inch guns on individual German strongpoints at point-blank range. This action proved decisive in breaking the German defense at Omaha Beach. This was the moment German officers realized that American industrial might was not just about the number of ships, but the willingness to risk them, to use them as expendable assets. The USS Corey was lost, but others immediately took its place. Ships were not precious, irreplaceable assets as they were for the Kriegsmarine. They were tools, and America had thousands more. As the morning progressed, German observers witnessed something that defied their understanding of amphibious operations: the endless conveyor belt of men and material flowing from sea to shore. Landing craft tanks disgorged 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the beaches. Massive landing ship tanks, 328 feet long, beached themselves to discharge entire tank companies. Duck amphibious trucks swam ashore and drove up the beach to deliver supplies. By nightfall, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops, exceeding the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. In the first 24 hours, the Allies landed 1,700 tanks. The German 7th Army possessed fewer than 500 operational tanks in the entire region. The German response to the invasion revealed not just material inferiority, but a systemic breakdown. The legendary Panzer divisions, which had conquered France in 6 weeks in 1940, were paralyzed by Allied air supremacy and naval gunfire. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to intervene on D-Day, took 3 full hours to move the 10 miles to the coast, becoming a tragic procession of burning vehicles. When the surviving panzers finally engaged British forces, they encountered naval gunfire directed by forward observers. HMS Warspite, monitoring from 15 miles offshore, fired 15-inch cells that could penetrate any tank ever built. SS Standardführer Kurt Meyer wrote, "The enemy's material superiority was so great that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock."
On D-Day +1, German reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs that senior officers initially refused to believe. The Allies were building harbors, mulberry harbors, from nothing in the open sea. Prefabricated in Britain, these artificial ports consisted of 600,000 tons of concrete and 10 miles of floating roadways. Within 2 weeks, they were handling 9,000 tons of supplies daily. The Germans had spent 4 years building the Atlantic Wall to protect the ports. The Allies simply eliminated the requirement for ports. Throughout June 1944, German commanders realized the completeness of their intelligence failure. Operation Fortitude had convinced them the Normandy landings were a feint. The real invasion, they believed, would come at Pas-de-Calais, led by Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group. For crucial weeks, German reserves remained frozen, waiting for an invasion that never came. As June turned to July, reports became increasingly desperate. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel demanded to know why the invasion hadn't been thrown back into the sea, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt famously replied, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" For this honesty, von Rundstedt was immediately relieved of command. Rommel met with Hitler on June 17th, presenting statistics that showed the hopelessness of the German position, complete Allied air supremacy, and German divisions at 30% strength. Hitler's response was to forbid any retreat, demanding fanatical resistance. Rommel left the meeting, knowing Germany was doomed. The battle for Caen further demonstrated the futility of German resistance. On July 7th, 467 RAF heavy bombers dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on the city in 40 minutes, more explosive power than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in France. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, entered the battle with 150 tanks and 20,540 men. 6 weeks later, it had no tanks and only 300 men remaining. Operation Cobra, the American breakout beginning July 25th, provided the final demonstration of Allied supremacy. A concentrated carpet bombing attack by 1,500 heavy bombers dropped 3,300 tons of bombs on a small area. Lieutenant General Fritz Behrlein, commanding the Panzer Division directly under the bombardment, reported, "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial complex." Of 3,000 men in the targeted area, 1,000 died instantly. 1,000 were wounded, and 1,000 were too psychologically shattered to fight. The Falaise Pocket, from August 12 to 21, 1944, became the graveyard of German forces in Normandy. Between 10,000 to 15,000 Germans were killed, and 40,000 to 50,000 were captured. German forces lost 2,200 tanks and assault guns, and 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles. The German General Staff struggled to comprehend that they were not fighting a military campaign, but an industrial equation. The 1944 production comparison starkly illustrated Allied industrial dominance. German aircraft production was 39,879, while American production was 96,000. American tank production was 29,000 compared to Germany's peak monthly production of 1,854. American military truck production was 650,000, while Germany's was 68,000. General Franz Halder calculated that by 1944, the Allied advantage in war production was approximately 5-1, and in certain categories like trucks, it was 10-1. "We were not defeated, we were mathematically eliminated," he concluded. The German officers who survived Normandy were psychologically transformed. They had witnessed the complete invalidation of Nazi ideology about German superiority and American weakness. They had been told Americans were soft and spoiled, but instead discovered Americans had machines to do the hard work, radios to coordinate, and confidence from unlimited support. Beyond mere quantity, the Germans confronted a technology gap. Proximity fuses and radar-directed naval gunfire with first-round accuracy demonstrated how far behind Germany had fallen. Duck trucks solved logistics problems Germany couldn't even conceptualize. Throughout the campaign, German officers developed a particular dread of naval gunfire. The battleship HMS Rodney's 16-inch guns could fire 2,448-pound shells 23 miles inland. Ships like the USS Nevada and HMS Warspite turned their main batteries into super-heavy artillery that could obliterate any target. By July 1944, German movement in daylight had become virtually impossible due to Allied fighter bombers operating in cab ranks and controlled by forward observers who could strike any target within minutes. The final statistics from the Normandy campaign, from June 6 to August 30, 1944, told the story of industrial warfare. Allied forces landed 252,299 personnel, 438,471 vehicles, and 398,259 tons of supplies. German losses included 240,000 killed, 200,000 captured, and 2,200 tanks and assault guns lost. In 1954, surviving German officers gathered for a symposium. General Gunther Blumentritt,
Chief of Staff to both Rommel and von Rundstedt, delivered the keynote address. We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally. It was no longer a contest of armies, but of economic systems. We counted divisions, while they counted factories. We measured courage, while they measured production. The image that haunted him was American bulldozers pushing aside German tanks to clear roads for supply trucks. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy, compared his experience to those in Normandy, stating that in Italy they could fight on relatively equal terms, but in Normandy, where the Allies could deploy their full industrial might, German forces were simply erased. On the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen returned to Crisbecq Battery. Speaking to gathered veterans, he reflected, 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible. A sea covered with ships from horizon to horizon. I knew in that moment that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. Divided nations don't coordinate such an invasion. He added that firing his guns at that armada was like throwing stones at the tide. For every ship they hit, 100 passed unharmed. Ohmsen concluded, the real lesson is simpler. In modern war, the side that can produce the most wins. We learned that industrial capacity is military capacity. The sea of ships Ohmsen saw that morning was American industrial might made visible. The German officers who watched the nearly 7,000 Allied ships approach witnessed the future of warfare, where industrial capacity would trump every other consideration. They had prepared for war. They met instead the full industrial capacity of the United States. Their defeat was not military, but mathematical, not tactical, but industrial, not a failure of courage, but a shortage of trucks. It was a lesson written in steel across the English Channel on June 6, 1944, when the Impossible Armada announced that American industrial might had come to Europe and nothing would ever be the same again.